This Air India Express plane is approaching runway 10 at Kozhikode International Airport. In it are people returning to India after being stuck in Dubai due to the COVID lockdowns. But this isn't going to be a happy ending, because in 5 minutes, this plane is going to crash. At the end of the runway is a 110-foot cliff. The plane is going to touch down on the runway. The pilot will apply the brakes, but he won't be able to stop the plane. It'll overrun the runway, fall down the cliff, and break into 3 sections. This crash needn't have happened. Many unfortunate events, mostly man-made, combined to cause this tragedy. So the question now is, what just happened? Let's find out. This is the story of Air India Express 1344. Many people across the globe were stuck in other countries, unable to return home due to the sudden COVID lockdowns. And for people of the southern Indian state of Kerala, where Kozhikode is situated, the Middle East is a popular tourist and expat destination. So to bring Indian citizens stranded outside the country back home, the Indian government organized repatriation flights. And one such flight was Air India Express 1344. The aircraft used for this flight was a 14-year-old Boeing 737-800, which first flew for Air India Express in 2006. Other than requiring minor maintenance work over the years, the plane was in a good condition with no major issues recorded. It's the morning of August 7th at Kozhikode. An empty flight with just the crew takes off at 4:49 UTC, headed for Dubai. The flight was flown by a 59-year-old captain and a 32-year-old first officer. After a short flight, it lands uneventfully at Dubai International Airport at 8:11 UTC. The return flight was scheduled to depart 1.5 hours later at around 9:30 UTC. Due to COVID protocols, the boarding was slower than expected. This made the captain concerned and he was visibly anxious. The captain is going to play a major role in this incident. So let's talk about him. He was an ex-Indian military pilot and he had been working for Air India and then Air India Express from around the year 2000. He had around 11,000 hours of total flying experience, of which 4,500 hours were on the type. He had a medical history of diabetes, for which he was prescribed company-approved allopathic medications. But unknown to anyone at that time, he was also taking Ayurvedic medications for his diabetes. The combination of the two could lead to spikes in sugar levels and decreased situational awareness. The captain's training records had some curious remarks in them. Between the years 2009 and 2014, there were at least 9 comments by trainers and supervisors that said, unsatisfactory, loses concentration when under stress, and tends to float during landings. The captain's home base was Mumbai, and he was repositioned to Kozhikode on the 6th. He was scheduled to fly Flight 1344 to Dubai on the 7th, to be on standby duty on the 8th, and then had another Dubai flight on the 9th, before returning to Mumbai. Player number 2 in this incident is the airline, Air India Express. The way Air India Express bases its pilots is that the first officers are posted based on where they are required, but the captains can choose their home base as per their preference. This meant that at Kozhikode, there were 26 first officers, but only 1 captain stationed. Due to the sudden increase in the number of repatriation flights, there weren't enough captains in Kozhikode, and hence the captain of this flight was repositioned from Mumbai. The crew were undertaking their pre-flight checks when the captain got an update from Air India Express. The company had added an additional flight to the schedule and hence had to change the captain's roster. He was originally supposed to be on standby duty the next day, but as per the new schedule, he was now asked to fly a flight to Doha at 8:30 in the morning. Company policy required a minimum rest period of 12 hours between flights. And after adding on additional time for prep and for travel, the minimum gap required between the captain's two flights was 15 hours. Since his Dubai flight today was scheduled to return at 7 p.m. IST, the Doha flight the next day was rescheduled from 8:30 in the morning to 10 in the morning to get a 15-hour gap. But what this meant was that any delay to the landing time of this flight at Kozhikode would delay the departure of his flight to Doha the next day. This last-minute assignment put additional pressure on the captain to land back at Kozhikode on time. This was a reason for the captain's anxiety when the boarding of passengers in Dubai was delayed. Now, back to Dubai. 184 passengers and 10 infants boarded the flight and were eager to return to India after having spent an uncertain 6 months in Dubai. The pilots pushed back as soon as the doors closed, and they departed Dubai at 10:00 UTC. Destination: Kozhikode. Kozhikode is situated in the Indian peninsula. It experiences significant amount of rainfall due to its proximity to the Western Ghats to the east and to the Arabian Sea to its west. It's one of the wettest cities in India, and August is peak season for the southwest monsoon, which brings the city most of its rainfall. And on the day of the incident, the city was being battered by rain. The potential alternate airports for Kozhikode were Tiruchirappalli, Coimbatore, and Kochi. They chose Kochi as the alternate. Since both cities are on the same side of the Western Ghats, the weather in Kochi was very similar to that of Kozhikode. It was raining and had a visibility of 2,500 meters. 3.5 hours after leaving Dubai, and whilst 52 nautical miles from Kozhikode Airport, the pilots got in touch with ATC, who relayed that the visibility at Kozhikode was 1,500 meters with a moderate thunderstorm, surface winds at 270 degrees at 14 knots. Kozhikode Airport is also going to play a crucial role in the story. This airport has what's called a tabletop runway. It was constructed by shaving off the top of a hill to create a flat tabletop. These runways have steep drops at both ends and on the sides. At the end of runway 10, the ground drops 110 feet. Here's a video of an Airbus landing on the runway, and you can clearly see how steep the edges are on this runway. Kozhikode Airport is non-standard in many ways. Every runway has a runway end safety area, a racer. The racer is designed using special material to prevent airplanes from overshooting the runway. Racers are supposed to be 90 meters by 90 meters, but due to the unavailability of land, the width of the racer here varied between 71 meters and 85 meters. The airport also has a non-standard runway width. Due to land availability restrictions, the airport was approved to have a runway width of 75 meters. The standard minimum width for a runway is 140 meters. The runway lighting at the airport was also non-standard. Again, due to the unavailability of land, the approach lights of the runway, which the pilots used to see and locate the runway, was permitted to be 150 meters. Standard length of approach lights is 900 meters. Due to how non-standard this runway is, Kozhikode Airport is classified as a critical airport, which means that only the captain is allowed to operate the flight from this airport. The co-pilot can only be pilot monitoring. Kozhikode Airport was under two concurrent aerodrome warnings. One for the rain, and two because the wind was exceeding 17 knots. The conditions were so dangerous that the airport had proactively stationed airport fire engines at predetermined points along the runway. During the approach, the plane was flying in light rain and moderate turbulence conditions. Now, we already know that the plane failed to stop on the runway once it landed at Kozhikode. To understand the reasons better, you need to understand the various mechanisms available to a pilot to stop a plane. Here's a quick guide. The first are the speed brakes. Remember when, as a kid, you used to put your hand out of the window of the car and you'd feel the force of the wind on your hand and there's resistance? That is exactly what a speed brake is. If your hands were large enough, that wind resistance could have stopped the car. And we can use that same principle to stop a plane. Once the airplane touches down, the computer senses an increase in the force of the wheels and immediately pops up huge panels above the wing, which increases the drag and decreases the speed. The second are the reversers. During normal flight, the engines create thrust in this direction, which causes the plane to move in the opposite direction. But when the reversers are enabled, there is a panel in the engine that opens up and directs the engine output in the opposite direction. This will cause the plane to want to go in reverse, thus slowing the plane down. The reversers are not automatically deployed and will need to be manually enabled by the pilot flying. The third is manual braking. This is similar to how you stop your car. The pilot can step on the brake pedals to invoke manual braking and bring the plane to a stop. And the last is auto braking. Due to the heavy workload that the pilots have during landing, the airplanes are designed to brake itself. For this, the pilots need to set the auto brake functionality to one of 4 values. These 4 values define how quickly the plane will come to a stop. When max is selected, the plane will stop at the shortest distance possible, and when 1 is selected, the plane will come to a more gradual stop. But when the pilot manually brakes, the auto brake is automatically disabled and the computer gives full control of braking to the pilots. Now, in order to know what flap settings and auto brake values to use, the pilots are required to calculate a landing distance required value at every approach briefing. This needs to be done every time because no 2 approaches are ever the same. There could be differences in weather, aircraft weight, and flying style to account for. But these pilots on this approach didn't calculate it. The captain had operated 36 flights in and out of Kozhikode airport in the past 1 year, and he chose the auto brake and flap settings from memory. The plane was cleared for ILS approach for runway 28 at 13:44 UTC. The approach for runway 28 required the plane to fly to the VOR, overfly the runway, and then fly outward for a specific distance, do a U-turn, and then attempt the approach on runway 28. The ATC informed the crew that the runway visibility was 2,000 meters and it was decreasing to 1,500 meters. The wind was blowing from 280 degrees, there was light rain, and the runway surface was wet. The captain was concerned about visibility and instructed the first officer to ensure that the windshield wipers were working.
You just see that this works. Remember, put it too high.
And a minute later he said,
इसको on कर देते हैं.
The first officer turned the wipers on. Both the captain and the co-pilot saw the runway lead-in lights. And at exactly the same time that they saw the lights, the captain's windshield wiper stopped working.
Viper is gone. What a take for the Viper to go.
Due to the sudden decrease in visibility because of the wiper stopping, the captain could no longer sight the runway, and hence he decided to go around. They pressed the toggle switch and applied max power and executed the go-around procedure. The aircraft was then cleared by ATC to climb to 10,000 feet. Now there was an opportunity here for the accident to be averted, but it was not taken. Air India Express's operating procedures requires that if the windshield wipers are not functioning during rain, then the plane has to divert to an airport where it isn't raining. Remember, Kozhikode is a critical airport, and hence the pilot monitoring wasn't allowed to land the plane even if he had a perfectly functioning wiper. Kochi, their chosen alternate, was also in rainy conditions. The nearest airport that had clear weather was Coimbatore. They had sufficient fuel to divert to their alternates. Fuel was not an issue. But at no point did the captain nor the first officer discuss the possibility of a diversion. At the same time that all of this was happening, an Air India Airbus A320 with call sign Air India 425 is preparing to take off from Kozhikode, headed for Delhi. The current active runway is runway 28, but the pilot of Air India 425 requests the ATC for permission to take off from runway 10 instead. This is because there are active rain clouds over the direction of runway 28, and the Air India plane wanted to avoid it. The ATC accepted this request and immediately switched the active runway from runway 28 to 10 and gave Air India 425 taxi clearance to the runway. The ATC then asked the crew of Air India Express 1344 whether they would like to use runway 10 as well, and reported that the current wind was at 270 degrees and at 8 knots. So I've been mentioning the wind speed and wind direction quite a few times in this video. Why is the wind speed and wind direction important? Let's take a look. Airplanes usually land and take off against the wind. This is also called headwind. This is because the aircraft's wings relies on the speed of the air moving over it to lift it off the ground. Here's an example. This is a small Cessna 172. The takeoff speed is approximately 55 to 60 knots. Keep an eye on the windsock at the back. It'll show you how fast the wind is blowing. I'm going to park the plane and then increase the wind speed to 55 knots. And as I keep increasing the wind, at one point, the plane just starts to fly. I admit it's not stable because I'm not controlling it, but this is a good illustration to show that it's not the ground speed of the plane on the runway, but rather the speed of the wind over the wings that matters. The higher the wind speed over the plane, the shorter the takeoff or landing distance. For example, here, the takeoff distance was 0 meters. Now, let's flip the wind direction. The little plane now has a tailwind. The wind is blowing from the right to the left. And as you can see, as I start increasing the wind speed, the wind is pushing the plane forward. It doesn't fly. So to stop this plane, I need to press the brakes harder to counteract the wind. Which means, if I land with a tailwind, I'm going to need a much longer landing distance to bring the plane to a stop. So at this point, the ATC has asked the pilots whether they'd like to land on runway 10 instead of runway 28. Runway 10 was the inferior of the two runways. It doesn't have lead-in lights, and they would also be flying with a tailwind which would increase their landing distance. But on the other hand, remember, the captain is under pressure to make sure his flight the next day isn't delayed. He needs to land this plane on time. He was already half an hour late when he took off from Dubai, and he's now had to spend additional time due to the go-around. If he were to land on runway 28, he'd have to once again intercept the VOR, fly back over the runway, make a U-turn, and then attempt the landing at runway 28. There's also this concern that the weather system that they are in right now would move over the runway whilst they are setting themselves up for runway 28. Visibility is 2000 meters. Wind is at 260 degrees at 5 knots. Considering all this, they decide to land on runway 10. And for the second time today, no calculation of the landing distance was done. The pilots didn't brief each other either. The flaps and auto brake settings were set from memory. The crew chose flaps 30. The correct setting for this approach was 40. The crew chose auto brake 3. The recommended value was max. At 1400 UTC, Air India Express 1344 was then cleared to approach runway 10. 1 minute later, the Air India flight to Delhi departed from runway 10, and by this time, the wind speed had doubled to 10 knots and was gusting from 270 degrees. At 1406, the aircraft was established on the localizer. The captain then instructed the first officer.
I'll tell you when to put it on. थोड़ी देर में करते हैं. I hope it works.
He was referring to the windshield wiper. A minute later, the wiper was turned on, but it was working at a much slower speed.
स्पीड तो इतना ही रहेगी.
ATC cleared them to land on runway 10 with a visibility of 2000 meters and a wet runway surface. During landing, the plane needs to follow the glide slope. The glide slope is an imaginary 3-degree line from the end of the runway that planes follow for a normal landing. When the plane is on the glide slope, the pink diamond will be centered. The further the diamond is off-center, the further away from the glide slope they are. Things are going to start happening very fast now. The already heavy workload on the crew is increasing significantly. The first officer disengaged the autopilot at 500 feet above the ground. The pitch of the plane reduced and the descent rate started to increase, touching 1500 feet a minute. The ideal descent rate is 750 feet per minute. The first officer cautioned the pilot about the high rate of descent.
Rate of descent.
Check.
They were now 0.5 nautical miles from the runway. The airplane was well below the glide slope and was too close to the ground. The ground proximity warning system warned them with a
Glide slope. Glide slope.
warning. The plane was around 2 dots away from the glide slope. This has now become a very unstabilized approach. Noticing that the captain hadn't reduced the rate of descent sufficiently, the first officer cautioned him again.
Rate of descent, Captain.
Yeah. Correcting.
It's time we talked about the final player in this incident, the first officer. The first officer was a 32-year-old male. He had a total flying experience of around 2,000 hours, having joined Air India Express just 2 years prior to the incident. The first officer was flying with a captain whom he had never flown with before, with a captain who was almost twice his age, who was ex-Indian military, and was also a training captain within the company. Whereas the co-pilot himself had just 2 years of experience in the cockpit. The power gradient here was significant.
Rate of descent, Captain.
Yeah. Correcting.
The captain corrected the descent, and the plane momentarily went slightly above the glide slope. The plane crossed the threshold of runway 10 at a height of 92 feet. The engine thrust was at 61%. The auto throttle was commanding to reduce thrust to land the plane, but the captain increased the engine thrust to 83%. This caused the plane to not touch down, and instead it just floated above the runway for the next 5 seconds. The first officer tried to get the captain's attention by saying,
Just check it.
At this point, the aircraft was 2,500 feet from the start of the runway, and the touchdown zone would end in 500 feet. The touchdown zone is a marked area on the runway where the plane needs to land inside of in order to provide the pilots with sufficient distance to come to a stop. By not touching down in time, the plane was eating into valuable stopping distance. Remember, this plane is landing on a wet runway and with a tailwind, both of which would increase your landing distance. So it's important that they got this right. Also remember, these pilots hadn't calculated their actual landing distance during the approach. So they're basically just winging it. 2 seconds later, the captain reduced the thrust to try to get the wheels to touch the ground, but the plane had already crossed the end of the touchdown zone. The first officer said a feeble,
Captain, go around.
when a go-around call is given by either pilot, a go-around has to be carried out. Also, after 2 go-arounds, the pilots have to divert to an alternate airport and cannot attempt a third landing. But the captain here is under pressure to not delay the landing so that his flight the next day can take off on time. If he goes around now, he'll have to divert to Coimbatore. So, he ignores the go-around call. Due to the steep power gradient in the cockpit, the co-pilot doesn't override the captain and conduct the go-around himself. The plane touched down on the runway 1 second after the go-around call was made, at 14:10 UTC. The plane was traveling at around 165 knots at this point, and it had already consumed 4,438 feet of the available 8,858 feet. The captain then applied max manual braking. The speed brakes were automatically deployed. The first officer made mandatory callouts,
Speed brake, up. Auto brake, disarm.
but the captain didn't respond to these callouts. After 3 seconds, the captain deployed the thrust reversers, but then shut it off within 2 seconds before it had any impact. And at the same time that he shut off the reversers, he lifted his legs from the brake pedal, which reduced the braking effect. It is likely that he was in two minds about going around, but it was too late to spool the engines back up. But also, the plane wasn't stopping in time.
Shit.
He then applied the thrust reversers again. When the reversers hit maximum, the plane was already beyond the end of the runway and in the racer. Both pilots said
Shit.
it exited the runway at a speed of 85 knots, way higher than what the racer was designed for. It broke the ILS antennas and a fence before plummeting down the cliff of the tabletop runway. The plane fell 110 feet down the cliff. Unfortunately, this impact resulted in the death of 21 people, including the two pilots. The primary cause of the accident was attributed to the pilot flying not following established procedures and not going around when the approach was unstabilized. The investigation team also found systemic failures within the airline's training and rostering procedures, and the airport's design and certification as contributing factors to the incident. The investigators found that Air India Express didn't have its own simulators and was instead using those of Air India. And those simulators weren't properly maintained and had multiple flaws in how it performed. Due to this, the pilots were learning incorrect techniques in the simulator, what the industry refers to as negative training. Recommendations were also made to improve the runway lighting at Kozhikode Airport and to also increase the racer at both ends of the runway. The runway lighting was upgraded in October 2023, 3 years after the incident.